Welcome to part 2 of our digestive system podcast. In this, we will discuss the formation of the midgut and the hindgut and all tissue derivatives from those two sections of our endodermal tube. And primarily what we're going to focus on here is the umbilical herniation that's going to occur in the midgut, and then the reduction of that herniation as we pack the small and large intestine back into the abdominal cavity. As we mentioned previously, midgut derivatives are supplied by the superior mesenteric artery. So in this case, we're talking about the caudal portion of the duodenum, the remainder of the small intestine, the cecum, the vermiform appendix, ascending colon, and most of the transverse colon. This is where we will stop with the midgut and start with our hindgut derived tissue and portion of the transverse colon. Now, what I want you to envision here, again, we've mentioned previously that the growth of our alimentary canal, the intestines, are going to outpace that of the size of the abdominal cavity. So we're going to see that much of the midgut is going to herniate out into the umbilical cord. This is going to form the physiological umbilical herniation. Now, as this happens, we are going to look at a rotational axis. So if we could envision looking at the human body at the umbilicus area, we're going to see that the axis of the umbilicus is going to be the superior mesenteric artery. That's illustrated here in red. This is, if you could cut through this umbilical herniation, this is what you would see, the superior mesenteric artery at the axis. And we're going to have this midgut loop. We're going to have a cranial portion and we're going to have a caudal portion. And so the cranial portion here is going to be this brighter color. The caudal portion is this more dark color that we see. We're going to also see that part of this driving force moving out as the embryo is growing is the remaining connection of the yolk stalk with this midgut and its attachment down here to the umbilical vesicle. That's going to help to pull this out as the embryo is growing. Now here we can see we're calling this the omphaloenteric duct. Again, that's just going to be another name for our yolk stalk as we see in our illustration. So we herniate out into the umbilical cord. All right, there we have the cranial and the caudal portion. The cranial portion is going to give rise to the bulk of the small intestine. And then when we get to the caudal limb, we're going to see that that is the cecal diverticulum portion. And when we say cecal diverticulum, that's going to be the cecum and the vermiform appendix collectively together is going to form from that. So we're out in our umbilical herniation. Now, the first thing that's going to happen, as you can see in our illustration, we are going to rotate around the axis of the superior mesenteric artery counterclockwise 90 degrees. And so the cranial limb, you can see, is going to fall over onto the right-hand side. The caudal limb is going to rise up here on the left-hand side. So here we go. We're going over to the right. Here we're coming up to the left. That's at first 90 degrees of rotation as we just before we begin to reduce the herniation and pull the intestinal contents back into the abdominal cavity. So we went through that 90 degrees of rotation. Now we're going to reduce the herniation, and we're going to see that the small intestine is going to return first. The large intestine is going to return, and it's the large intestine that's going to rotate an additional 180 degrees. So it's 270 total degrees of rotation if we consider that first 90. All right. So we went through our first 90. Now, as we return, we're going to see that we're going to return the descending colon first. We're going to lay it, well, the small intestine's coming in, but then we rotate around. We're going to lay the descending colon down first. Then we're going to go through another 90 degrees of rotation. We've laid down the descending colon. Now we're going to lay down the transverse colon. That's going to go all the way across the body. And after we deposit that transverse colon, then we're going to have, lastly, we're going to have the descent of the ascending part of the colon. And they call it the descent of the cecum, or the descent of the cecal diverticulum. And that's going to pull us around into our proper formation. We've got small intestine in the center. Remember, that's returned first. Then we've got the descending colon with 90 degrees, transverse colon with 90 degrees, followed by this lowering of the cecum. And again, with our initial 90 degrees, that's 270 degrees of rotation from the herniation to reduce that back into the body. Now, we've got a lot of our intestinal contents in, and some of these are actually going to be retroperitoneal. We say fixed to the body wall. So the ascending and descending colon are going to be retroperitoneal, and that's going to be covered over again by this omental bursa, which is going to actually become the greater omentum. And so here in our illustration, we can see we've got the omental bursa. It's coming down. We've got the descending colon. We've got the transverse colon. And if we look at these different planes of section, here we can see we've got the ascending colon, the descending colon. Here's the jejunum. This is the middle portion of our small intestine. If we look in a sagittal section, again, we've already got our duodenum and pancreas. You see how they're retroperitoneal. They're already imprinted into the body wall. Here's transverse colon. Here's the ileum. This is the bottom portion then, the last portion of our small intestine. And watch what happens to these as we go through and fix. Again, ascending and descending colon, they're going to be retroperitoneal, much like the duodenum. The transverse colon is going to get embedded into this portion of the greater omentum. And then we have this the mesentery proper. Some refer to this as mesointestine. That's going to be attaching the ileal portion of our small intestine back to the body wall. So we mentioned how the cecal diverticulum, that's going to help to pull down the ascending part of our colon. And so about the 6th week, we're going to see the cecal diverticulum, and that's going to be swelling on that caudal limb of the midgut loop. This is going to give rise to the cecum. The cecum is this blind-ended pocket on the end of the beginning part of the colon, and then the appendix, vermiform meaning worm-like, this is going to grow off of the cecum. So here we can see we've got the yolk stalk that's connecting off here. Here is where we're going to form that cecal diverticulum. Here we have ileum coming in. This is going to be this location of our ileocolic valve, the ascending colon. Then we've got our cecum with the appendix coming off here. And this just shows how that can grow. Sometimes if this appendix gets extremely long, it can curve back, and actually you can have the opening in a couple of different places. You can have it on this side of the colon and it coming back around and actually have a different attachment. This is called a retrocecal appendix, where it's coming back in and you actually have connections to the cecum in 2 different locations. This is not extremely rare, but it's not all that common either. Now, looking at other midgut derivatives, we talk about the spleen, and mostly we talk about the spleen not as a component of the digestive system. It's not even an accessory gland, but because this develops within the dorsal mesentery, the dorsal mesogaster, we cover that here. So the spleen is one of our largest lymphatic organs. We know, again, in histology, we'll cover this in much more detail, but in the process of blood percolating through the spleen, this is where we're also going to screen and filter and destroy a lot of the old and dying red blood cells. And now let's look at a video illustrating the midgut and midgut-derived tissues. Now, lastly, we're going to look at hindgut. This is the last portion, the most caudal portion of our alimentary canal. And so here we are being supplied by inferior mesenteric artery. So we begin at the transverse colon. We'll go through the remainder of the colon, the rectum, but we're also going to include urinary bladder, the epithelium, and most of the urethra. This is all going to be produced by hindgut derived tissue, which will in some cases include the allantois, and we'll include that in our discussion. So we first talk about the cloaca, and the cloaca in the developing embryo. Now, cloaca literally means sewer. So here we're going to have a terminal boundary, and this is essentially in lower organisms where you would have urinary products, you would have solid waste products, you would have your reproductive products. But here in this case, it's just simply going to be the area where we're going to develop the proctodeum, and we're going to also develop our urinary canal. And so just like we had the anterior or cranial membrane, here we've got the cloacal membrane, and this is going to close off the posterior portion then of our alimentary canal. So here in our sagittal sections, we can see midgut. This is yolk stalk again. They've got this new terminology with it, the omphaloenteric duct. And we can see the hindgut coming around, and here's our cloaca. Again, we're going to have portions for our solid waste, which is going to be our rectum, and then we have our urinary system. We haven't divided them off yet. You can see that we're in the process of doing that in these various illustrations. Now let's look at the mechanics of how we're going to do that. So in the cloaca, we're going to have this solid column of tissue that's called the urorectal septum. This is going to grow between the allantois, which I mentioned previously, and the hindgut. And as it advances, it's going to further separate our alimentary canal from our urogenital system. And it's going to fuse with and connect with the cloacal membrane to finalize that separation. Here we can see our urorectal septum in both illustrations, moving closer and closer to our cloacal membrane. And as we do, we're going to enfold this area of our alimentary canal, the hindgut in this region, and we can see those portions of the wall coming in closer and closer. And I think you can see how we're going to separate those out. So in this cloacal region, we're going to see that the dorsal portion, we're going to separate that into the rectum and then the anal canal, and the ventral portion is our urogenital sinus. We're going to cover that a lot more as we get to our urogenital system. And then once we fuse our urorectal septum with the cloacal membrane, now we're going to have the anal membrane, which is going to be the dorsal closure of the rectum and the anus, and the ventral portion, which is going to be the urogenital membrane that's going to cover over our urogenital sinus. Now we're going to have a solid piece of tissue between, and this is called the perineal body. And in humans, this is going to be that solid block of tissue then that is going to separate our genitalia, male and female genitalia, from our anus. And that tissue on the very bottom, that is called our perineum. And so here we can see we have fused our urorectal septum with our cloacal membrane. Here we have the proctodeum, this invagination. And when we do that, this solid tissue in the middle, that is going to develop into our perineum. Here we have our rectum. It's going to have the anal opening. And then here we've got our urogenital sinus that we're going to modify into our urogenital canals. And later we're going to develop into our male and female genitalia. Now, as we get toward the end, and this is where we separate the endoderm from the ectoderm, here we can see the rectum coming down, and the yellow is illustrating endodermally derived epithelium, and the blue is going to be our ectodermally derived tissue, much like we have with the skin. And we have two different dividing lines, the first of which is not going to have a histological designation. This is just going to be where the ectoderm and the endoderm, that junction is, it's called the pectinate line. But then we also have a white line. This is going to be an acutaneous line. This is where we get a histological change from our columnar epithelium that typically lines our digestive tract, our alimentary canal, with stratified squamous epithelium, so very tall cells versus very flattened cells. And that's going to be at the white line. And that's going to be just that histological designation between these two different morphologically looking cell types. Now, we can see that in this case, we have derivatives, and we said hindgut, so it's got to be internal mesenteric artery. And what we're going to see from this, we have the superior rectal artery going to that superior 2/3 that's endodermally derived, and then the inferior rectal artery going to the inferior 1/3 that is ectodermally derived. Now, these are all coming off of the inferior mesenteric artery. They're all branches off that, even though we have these two different designations and supplies. Now, let's finish off this podcast with a very short clip of hindgut.